We're going to be bringing our book review forward this morning, The Age of Decay. It's a provocative read that author Shamil Ismail hopes will stimulate debate over the impact of changing demographics on society. The book explores just how declining fertility rates globally will lead to a shrinking workforce and, more importantly, to a reduced number of essential workers, which could massively disrupt everyday lives. Shamil Ismail is an investment analyst qualified as a chartered accountant and a chartered financial analyst. He's going to be joining us virtually this morning to share a little bit more about his book, his latest offering. Shamil, good morning, and thank you for your time on the SABC at this hour.
Good morning, Liesl. Happy to be here.
Perhaps we could start at the very beginning, the onset of this idea that's now culminated into this latest work. Perhaps you could speak to the book, the research that had been done prior to putting everything together. Ultimately, what led to that discovery?
Sure. So in my day job, we look at the growth of markets, we look at the growth of consumption, etc. And one of the striking things is that over the past 100 years, we've just had sort of one trend, which is the upward movement or trend in population growth. But that's starting to change. Already in some countries, we are seeing a declining population, like, for example, China, Japan, Italy, etc. And by next year, by 2025, there will be 31 countries that will actually experience declining population. So this will have significant impacts on consumption, on economies, and even societies, on our day-to-day living. So that's what I wanted to explore in this research and book.
Okay, let's delve a little bit more into that, because you are of the view that aging populations and declining birth rates are ultimately leading to a shrinking workforce of essential workers in developed countries, which could disrupt society and economies of scale. What does this mean for capitalist societies at large?
Well, as a company, you need to deliver growth in profits, and that will drive your share price, etc. And then profits come from increased consumption, increased demand for your product, and increased profitability from those sales. But ultimately, the feedstock for that growth is consumers. Whether it's a bank, whether it's a resource company, or a retailer, they all need growth in consumption to fuel growth in profits. And when that starts tapering off, we will actually have to rethink the whole approach to how do we decide where to invest in. But the book's actually much broader than just the economic picture. There are substantial parts on the impact of the trends in education that we are seeing today of the younger generation, and how that will conflict with the demands of the workforce in future, when that workforce is actually substantially smaller and the population composition is a lot older.
That's a valid point. I actually wanted to look at the contributing factors as a result then to this phenomenon, to this age of decay. How at this point it could be reframed to explore possibilities and probabilities. We look at the impact also on the ripple effects along the value chain. Who is said to be first affected from your vantage point as well?
So there's various aspects to this. The one aspect, just in terms of the actual delivery of services. So you could have creating supply chains when you don't have enough workers to actually deliver the product. Now, some may think that we can actually scale down proportionately. If our population is smaller, then maybe we need less services, and that will reduce. But one of the critical findings in my research is that our infrastructure, and when you think about water, think about electricity, things that's very close to us here in South Africa in terms of the service delivery. But what I'm positing is that in developed countries, where you have sophisticated infrastructure supporting those developed economies, you need an army of essential workers. And because the population will age and decline, and because of the size of the labor force, the working age population will decrease. And add to that another layer where in developed countries, more and more youngsters are enrolling for tertiary education. You have this growing void of essential workers that cannot actually maintain those systems.
You know, Shamil, I am thinking about the continent at large, which arguably has the world's youngest population. And just given the research and the trends that's also and the data that's come to the fore, I wonder if you could speak to which countries would be most affected at this point, the impact on the standard of living as well, how this is going to also impact, the geopolitical landscape. If we're looking at the trends as well, revealing the future for children, you've alluded to this in terms of education at large and skills. What comes to the fore on that front?
That's a loaded question. So there's a couple of parts to that I need to address. So the first part is the African story. So in the book, I've actually dedicated a chapter which I've titled The African Century, because Africa will actually benefit from these trends because the population will continue to grow. We have high fertility rates across the continent. And according to the UN forecast, by the end of the century, 41% of working age people will actually be from Africa. Now, just imagine that scenario. You've got an aging Western world, and you've got a burgeoning population in Africa, which will be hugely positive, and will be, the opportunity will be there for countries across the continent to capitalize on this in terms of providing services and skills to the rest of the world that's really in need of it. The second part, in terms of the opportunities, in terms of who will be most affected in terms of the negative impact. So my forecast suggests that we can have a fairly benign situation over the next few years up to the end of this decade. From 2040, though, we're going to have an escalation because more and more countries will experience a shortage of workers. We're already seeing this, by the way, in countries like Japan, Australia, Canada, and Germany. And right now, they are able to deal with that in sort of small numbers. But when it starts aggregating, when it starts escalating, you're going to have this avalanche impact where it really snowball, and you're going to have that driving up the wages, etc., which is positive for the contributing nations that's actually delivering those workers.
Shamil, I want to wrap up. I've got a few more questions, but perhaps in closing, you've just painted a picture of what the world is ultimately also, possibly going to look like for the decades to come. I wonder also, given these shifting dynamics, the issue of migration comes to the fore, pervading attitudes about migration. I definitely think there's going to be a shift in that. What have you observed on that front, particularly in a South African context?
So that's correct. So what we are finding is that there's going to be some social conflict, especially in Western countries, because if you look at the political rhetoric in some countries, you will see that there is sort of anti-immigration platforms being raised, and they are quite popular in the West. But the reality is that they need the workers. And the companies in those very countries are lobbying strongly for this, because you can't have your services and not the labor to supply it. So in terms of the impact on Africa, we can look at Zimbabwe, and the initial impact is a bit negative because you have a kind of a brain drain where your workers actually go overseas. But in the long run, it is positive. And I show the example of both Ireland and India, where they had that initial sort of drain of skills.
Yes.
But in the next generation, you see the positive spin-offs of that.
Well, Shamil, thank you for your time at the SABC and for exploring your latest offering. I'm going to have to leave the conversation there for now. We'll continue to monitor developments, of course, as it gains traction. Age of Decay, it's a book, an offering by Shamil Ismail, where he explores why aging populations and also declining birth rates are leading to a shrinking workforce of essential workers within developed countries at large. Again, thank you to him for joining us at this hour.